In this part, we'll create our first app service resource via the Azure portal. I'm logged into the portal. Let's click Create a Resource here. And then let's choose to create a web app or a web API. That's the one we need. Both translate to an Azure App Service. But what's with that naming then? Well, that's for historic reasons. In the past, there used to be a few differences between these, but today all features available as web app service are available as API app service and vice versa. The main difference is that the icon is different. If you prefer, as an alternative, you can go to the marketplace and search for API app or web app. You immediately see app services show up here. By clicking the plus button, you can choose to create a web app. And that brings us to the exact same screen we were on a few seconds ago. No matter which approach you choose, the end result will be an app service. As you can see, we need to fill out a few details here. We need to choose the subscription and the resource group. Subscription is easy in my case, I only have one, so I'm going to use that one. And as far as the resource group is concerned, we can choose one of the existing ones here, but we can also choose to create a new one. The resource group we want in this case is related to the travel inspiration application, and we don't have that yet, so I'm going to choose to create a new one. As mentioned in the previous section, as a good practice, we're going to start with the name of the department inside of the company, so AppDev. Then I add the resource type, RG, for the resource group. The environment, Dev for development, the region, WE for West Europe, and then a functional description, travel inspiration in our case. We click OK, and this resource group will be created once we create this web app. For the web app resource name, we follow likewise principles, so AppDev, app for app service, Dev for development, WE for West Europe, and travel inspiration. What we're going to publish to this is our compiled code, so this option is okay here, and we choose .NET as a runtime stack. The operating system is Windows, so let's stick to that. And as mentioned, the region will be West Europe. The next thing we need to choose is the pricing plan or app service plan. Let's have a look at Microsoft's documentation for that, which you can find via the link on screen. As mentioned here, when you create an app service plan in a certain region, for example West Europe, as that's the one we're using currently, a set of resources, compute resources, is created for that plan in that region. Whatever apps you then put into that app service plan run on these compute resources. What you can see here is that each app service plan defines a few things, like the operating system, the region, the number of virtual machine instances, the size of them, and the pricing tier. Depending on the pricing tier, you can get more or less features or pay more or less. It's always possible to switch to a different pricing tier in case you need it. To find out more about what you get and how much all of that costs, have a look at the Azure pricing page over on azure.microsoft.com/pricing. Here you can find information about the pricing for all different Azure resources. Let's go to Compute, and here we can see a link to the Azure App Service page. Now let's have a look at the pricing page. So now we're on the Azure App Service on Windows pricing page, and if you scroll down here, you can find the different plans, what you get for them, and how much all of that costs. So this is a very interesting page to have a look at regularly before you start creating and adding things on Azure. An app service plan is pretty cheap, but some resources can become quite costly quite fast. So always make sure that you check out the pricing first to avoid unwelcome surprises. Alright, let's go back to the portal. I've already got a basic pricing plan with the correct naming set up, so I'm going to use that. AppDev ASP for App Service Plan, Dev WE. Alright, that's it for this page. Let's click Next. On this page, we can immediately link our API to a database. Our API does integrate with a database, but I'm not going to set that up here. We will deal with databases later on in the section on working with Azure SQL. On the next step, we can set a few deployment options. If you want, you can enable continuous deployment here. We won't do that. If we scroll down a bit more, we can choose the authentication settings for deployment. By default, Entra ID authentication is enabled and basic authentication isn't. If you deploy using the Azure CLI, Entra ID authentication is sufficient. But if you deploy from Visual Studio, at the moment of recording, basic authentication is still required. So I'm going to enable this. Let's click Next. This is the Networking tab. We want our API to be available publicly, so Enable Public Access should be on. And we leave Network Injection, which allows outbound traffic to a virtual network, on off. Up next is Monitoring and Securing. You see that by default, Application Insights is enabled. Application Insights is a service that enables monitoring your app. We will do that later on in a lot of detail, but for now I'm going to disable this. We have no need for that at the moment. And then there's a small upsell here from Microsoft. You can enable Microsoft Defender if you want. This detects a variety of threats, but it also costs money. I'm not going to enable that for the demo, but you may want to do that in high-risk environments. Up next, you can add tags. Let's leave that on empty. And then there's the Review step. Here we can verify that everything we configured is as we want it to be. Everything looks okay. Let's click Create. Deployment is being initialized and submitted, and now it is in progress. If at any given time you want to have a look at how the deployment is going, you can always have a look by clicking the notification icon on top here. From there, you can go back to the page where the current deployment steps are in progress. And there we go. It seems like our deployment was successful. Let's click Go to Resource here to have a look. Here's our app service. It seems like this was nicely deployed as we configured it. The name is correct, the resource group is correct, and if you look at the configuration blade, which we can find here, we can also see that the correct stack and platform were selected and set up. From here, you can now manage your resource and potentially change it. You can manipulate the app service plan if needed. You can have a look at the activity log. You can control who has access and so on. We'll look into a few of these during the course. If you have a look at the overview blade, you can also see a URI here. This is where our web app is hosted, and it seems that everything is up and running. Our web app is waiting for our content, so let's deploy our API to it. We're in Visual Studio and we're looking at our demo API project. I'm going to publish this to our newly created app service. To do that, let me right-click our Travel Inspiration.api project and choose Publish. I want to publish to Azure, so Azure is what I choose. Let's click Next. And then I choose the Windows-based Azure App Service, as that is what we just created. In case you're not signed in, you will be asked to enter your credentials. Otherwise, you should see your subscription here. What you see here on screen now are the resource groups that are available. And if we click open our Travel Inspiration resource group, we should find our app service, and that is indeed the case. Note that you can also choose to create a new one directly from Visual Studio by clicking Create New here. So yes, from Visual Studio 2 you can create resources when publishing, but what you can do here is pretty limited. As you can see, there's not as much to configure here as you could on the portal. So this is something I consider good to quickly test something, but in reality, starting from Visual Studio isn't the best way to go, in my opinion. So we're not going to do that. So I'll select the app service I want, which is our Travel Inspiration app service. And let's click Finish. What's going to happen now is that a publish profile will be created. This only has to happen once. It seems like it's done, so let's click close, and it's automatically opened. You see it on screen here. What I want to publish is a release version targeting .NET 8, so the two settings here for configuration and target framework are already okay. This info is coming from our project configuration, so you do need to check that this matches the app service you want to deploy to. The hosting info below here, that's coming from the app service, as that will be our host. If we scroll down, we see something else. A dependency seems to have been detected on a SQL Server database. Depending on your code base or on which packages you have referenced, this will contain different dependencies. For example, if you add in something like JWT Bearer Authentication, a dependency on Entra ID will show up here. If you add in an Entity Framework Core DB context and reference the required packages for SQL Server, a database dependency will show up here, and so on. That's very convenient, as you will see later on. Allowing an app service to access a database requires a bit of additional setup. But by deploying like this, the setup for that is automatically taken care of. But we are not going to do that now. Working with Azure SQL is coming up later on in the course. So for now, I'm just going to ignore this dependency. I can do that by clicking the three dots here, and then I'm going to choose to ignore this for all profiles. And there we go. And that's it already. Let's give this a try. I click the Publish button on top here, and that should start the process. And there we go, our API was published and automatically opened at the root. There's nothing there, so we get back a 404 not found. But if we go to API/destinations, we should get back 2 destinations, 2 instead of the whole list, because the amount we get back is limited by the amount to return value from the app settings file. So there we go, this is how you can publish something to an app service. But in Azure, there's rarely just one way to complete a task. Creating or updating an app service is not different. We just did it via the portal, but another common way of doing so is via the Azure CLI. Let's have a look.